Everybody. This is Tyler Jones, Associate Director at Entercom Inc. It's my pleasure today to introduce CoreLaboratories presenting at our 25th annual The Oil and Gas Conference. CoreLaboratory has been a longtime presenter here at the conference and a supporter of us here at Entercom, and we're very happy to be welcoming them back again today. CoreLab is a leading provider of reservoir description and production enhancement. To tell us a little bit more about the company and what they've been up to lately, we have their Senior Vice President of IR, Gwen, and CEO Larry Bruno, excuse me. Guys, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks very much. Always happy to be included in the Entercom presentation, a day and conference. I believe we're 25 for 25 in terms of our participation. I want to give you a little bit of background talking about CoreLab. For those of you that might be new to the story, we're an oil field service company dedicated to the oil field projects. We've been in business now 84 years, so we've got quite a long legacy. And the things that we try to focus on are being technologically innovative and market leaders in the areas that we choose to participate. And where our focus is on helping our clients optimize their reservoirs. And by that, we mean helping them get more oil and gas out of their reservoirs today, but more importantly, maximizing the ultimate recovery of their oil and gas assets over the life of the field. Okay, so we run the business for many years under 3 financial tenets and stick to these very closely with a lot of discipline. Those 3 tenets are to maximize free cash flow. Secondly, to maximize return on invested capital, because we believe that that is ultimately a great driver of shareholder value. And then finally, to return excess capital to our shareholders through a combination of share buybacks and dividends. We operate in 2 business segments, reservoir description and production enhancement. So if you look at the slides there over in blue, reservoir description, that accounts for about 60% of our business. When you think of reservoir description, think of that as a laboratory-based business. That's where we analyze rocks and fluids that are part of our clients' subsurface assets. It's a highly international business. About 80% historically of that business derives from projects outside of the United States. Over on the production enhancement side, think of that as field-based business, products and services. That business has been much more exposed to the U.S. business, about 2/3 of that being U.S. land, and about 1/3 being international. Now that's obviously shifting over time, and I should point out the revenues that you see here from 2019. That business is now pretty close to sub-equal international and U.S. as the U.S. has contracted. I do want to make a point here on the production enhancement side. There's a combination of products and services. On the reservoir description side, that's almost entirely services. So just a little perspective on our clients' spending on a project and where we might come in. Early in our clients' efforts to develop a reservoir during exploration, appraisal, and primary development, they're in a net negative present value position. They're laying out money and they haven't produced any oil and gas to get any return yet. Over time, if they've done their job right, they'll get on to this red line and get a return that exceeds their investment and get a positive return on investment. What CoreLab tries to do is to get them off of that red line and onto that yellow line. By employing our technologies, we help to improve their ultimate recovery, so more oil and gas produced over the life of the field, and improve their internal rate of return, so they get more money back faster. That's our objective. So a little bit about where we position the company in terms of our clients' spending habits or spending profile. This pyramid represents the budgets of our clients. And what you'll notice is that CoreLab tries to focus its efforts on the bottom part of this pyramid, the appraisal, production enhancement, and production parts of our clients' spending budget. And that's done with some thought. For one, it's a less risky part of our client spending. During times like we've gone through lately, frontier and exploration work tend to drop off, but appraisal, production enhancement, and production tend to be sticky, as people still need to get oil and gas out of the ground. A little bit about the people we work for. The integrated oil companies and national oil companies each account for between 20 and 25% of Core Lab's revenue. The remaining 55% comes from technologically sophisticated independents. And those would be names that you would recognize: EOGs, Apaches, Oxys of the world. These are all companies that need the science that we provide, but don't have internal laboratories of their own. There are about 4,000 producing oil fields of size on the planet. We operate in about 1,300 of those. And one of the ways we grow the company is by entering new fields. And so developments that have occurred, say, offshore Guyana, we've had a very nice participation in those. Those are new fields that we've been entered. But on the other hand, places like the North Slope of Alaska, we've been involved in and doing project work up there for 4 decades, and we'll continue to do work up there. And for the new discoveries, we tend to be pretty sticky. Once we get into a field, we'll tend to stick around for the duration of the field, and it'll come a little bit in waves over time as we participate, and then they move into the next phase, and there might be a little bit of time when we're not involved, and then we'll gear back up all the way up to the time when they get to abandonment of the fields. So if you've listened to the Core Lab story over time at all, you've heard us talk a lot about decline curves. And so just a little bit of a primer here for those of you that might not be used to looking at graphs of this type. Over on the left side of the screen, you see a typical decline curve for a conventional field. And what you see there is the oil produced over time naturally declining. All oil fields will go through a decline, and this shows a representative profile for a conventional field. What Core Lab tries to do by bringing its technologies to bear is to get people off that solid black line and onto that dashed black line, filling in the gap there with incremental production. So more oil and gas every day and more oil and gas over the life of the field. Compare the shape and the slope of those curves to the graph on the right, which shows a typical unconventional field. You'll notice that it's a much steeper decline. I often refer to unconventional reservoirs as a very unforgiving treadmill. They decline very rapidly, and new wells have to be drilled in order to replace that declining production. But the same process is important here to try to move our clients off the black line, solid line, and onto the black dashed line. Typically, in a conventional reservoir, maybe 40 to 45% of the oil in place will get produced over the life of the field. In an unconventional reservoir, using traditional techniques, that might be about 9%. If we could help our clients move that to 11, 12, 13%, there's a big incremental advantage for them because their expensive things have been done. They don't have to drill another well. If we can develop an EOR process for them that helps them get that extra few percent of oil out of each well. So Core Lab operates around the world, and we deliver a wide variety of services. Some of these you might be familiar with: geologic sciences, which is where my particular background is. We also analyze the reservoir fluids. We developed a bunch of innovative technologies for characterizing the rocks and the fluids. We also, on the production enhancement side, look at things like completion diagnostics. Think about an unconventional well that might be 10,000 feet deep, 10,000 feet lateral. That's 4 miles roughly from the surface. They're trying to execute a completion program. Our completion diagnostics help people unravel whether they've completed the well the way they intended. Also things like our energetic systems, which are vital to create successful communication between the reservoir and the plumbing system that they've built with the tubulars in the subsurface. So let's talk a little bit about how we structure our physical footprint around the planet. We work on a hub and spoke structure where we've got 6 advanced technology centers and then a bunch of regional specialty centers spread around the planet. Now, we operate in more than 50 countries. The map gets pretty covered up when we put all the locations on there, but the concept is the important thing here. We have operations close to where our clients activity is, and then we migrate the rocks and the fluid samples into the advanced technology centers for the more advanced testing. That allows us to maximize utilization of our equipment and also have our centers of excellence focused on developing new products and services that'll be deployed throughout our global network and service our client base. So it really doesn't matter whether it's an offshore well or an onshore well. At some point, if a operator is going to evaluate their assets in the ground, they're going to have to recover pieces of the rock and fluid samples. And here you see some of our internally developed digital imaging technology using CAT scanners that we use to characterize the rock. We can get our clients pretty close in terms of petrophysical properties like storage capacity, which would mean porosity, and flow properties, which would mean permeability and variations of that, and also doing tasks like log calibration. There's many respected companies that do downhole logging, but all of those logs have to be calibrated to the ground truth. And that the rock work that we do in the laboratory provides that ground truth. And then the logs are shifted or calibrated to the physical properties that we determine in the rock. So we provide the firm answers, and then the logs are used to be shifted to reflect the calibration points that we provide. One of the new technology offerings that we've come up with, we've packaged into a brand or branded as a package known as NITRO, which stands for Non-Invasive Technology for Reservoir Optimization. And those include things like high frequency nuclear magnetic resonance, dual energy CT work, X-ray fluorescence, and micro CT work. So most of these technologies have applications outside of the oil industry. And what our scientists have done is find ways to take the physics or the chemistry from these different technologies and apply them to evaluating reservoir rocks. What you see here is the outgrowth of many years of invested perspiration and inspiration to come up with these technologies, and also with an eye toward automating laboratory processes wherever we can. We do make a lot of our instruments ourselves because there's not many people that do what we do. And if you go into some of the big NOC and IOC internal laboratories, you'll see CoreLab equipment because we're regarded as the gold standard for how to make these types of measurements. So it somewhat pains me as a geologist to say this over time, but there's not a lot of intrinsic value in the rocks in the ground. What is of value is the hydrocarbons in the ground, and that's the oil and the natural gas. And at some point, our clients are going to have to take samples of that oil and natural gas, and they'll do it through a formation tester, one of the ways they'll acquire those samples, and they'll bring that to the surface, and then we'll transport those pressurized samples into the laboratory, and we'll conduct tests on the samples to determine the composition and what's referred to as the PVT, or pressure, volume, temperature, phase behavior characteristics of that fluid. In other words, is it going to be a volatile oil where there's going to be a lot of gas coming out of solution? Or is it going to be a condensate, which is going to transition from a gas into a liquid while the reservoir is being produced? Those are things that the clients have to know if they're going to maximize production out of the reservoir. Now, I'm going to shift over a bit to the production enhancement side of the business, but I don't want to leave behind here in your minds what we learned from looking at the rocks, because one of the big advantages that CoreLab has in the area of downhole products, say energetics for completing wells, is our understanding of the reservoir rock. So with that 80+ years of experience in core and fluid analysis and our industry-leading perforating and completion expertise, those can be combined to help our clients maximize their oil and gas reservoir production. So here you see a laboratory set up, what's called our rock lab, our reservoir optimized completions lab, that's up outside of Fort Worth in Texas. And all of the equipment that you see in the foreground and along the sides, that's all proprietary flow loop pumping built and designed by CoreLab through the eyes of a core analyst for evaluating what happens when we perforate a rock and then try to flow through it. So a lot of expertise over the years that we developed for doing that to evaluate the reservoir can be brought to bear in evaluating the completion. So in that cell that you see that we built on the left, and for sense of scale, it probably takes 3 people hand to hand to get their arms around that large cell. We can change the orientation, we can vary the pressure, the temperature, the fluids that are in the rock, and the orientation of the core and the bedding planes in the core, so we can match it up to what exists in the subsurface as we're trying to evaluate different energetic options. So here's how this would work. We capture a core, we bring it in the lab, we do some analysis on it, we capture fluids, we do analysis on those, we evaluate the reservoir data, and so we understand what the client's challenges are with that particular reservoir. We then take that information and put rock samples into a very large pressure vessel, and then we try and experiment with different energetics to create optimized perf tunnels. So again, with our knowledge of the rocks, we're in a position to do that, as opposed to folks who don't have a reservoir description area. They're going to have a line of products that are not based on actual physical testing in rocks that match up with those of the actual reservoir. We'll then flow through those reservoirs and we'll get that fluid back and see what gives us the best return of energetics. So the actual downhole hardware that we build comes in many forms and styles, and we'll talk about a couple of them here. One is our pre-assembled gun offering. That's the Go gun. Just a little bit of history here. For many decades, the perforating business was one of components where people that made guns and people that made the energetics or det cord or switches made and specialized in those individual pieces of the system. And then somebody, a third party, would assemble those and put them together. And a few years back, some foresighted companies saw opportunities to put it all together for the clients and deliver it as a pre-assembled gun. CoreLab is now in that business too, and we have our offerings. They're commercial, and we're ready to take advantage of the next upswing in the business in terms of demand for these types of pre-assembled guns. At the end of the day, though, the driver in the perforating business has always been the actual performance of the energetics. And now that there are maybe half a dozen or so companies that offer pre-assembled kits, the focus is shifting back to the performance of the energetics. And that's where CoreLab's always had a technological advantage because of our understanding of how the energetics react with different rocks. So one of the keys that we found when we worked toward an enhanced oil recovery project for our clients on the reservoir description side, particularly as it relates to unconventional reservoirs, is that we found that surface area, the amount of rubbleization that you could create uniformly around the wellbore, was critical to maximizing that enhanced oil recovery opportunity. We dialed that into our rock knowledge, into the energetics design, and into our study of evaluating proppants, and came up with approaches and techniques for our clients to apply when they go to set their reservoir up, not only for primary production, but for enhanced oil recovery opportunities. We were approached a while back by a company that said, hey, we see a lot of rock that's been untapped in some of these long lateral horizontal completions, but they were having little or no success using diverter technologies. And that's because when the diverters were put in place to try to plug the initial entry points between the casing and the reservoir, they were unsuccessful. When they went to refrac the wells, the fracs would simply go down the same paths that had already been stimulated. They wouldn't get to the new layers. So this client came up with an approach using mechanical isolation, in which they would insert a second tubular string inside the existing casing. So now they came to us and said, hey, we think we can get this to work, get actual confirmed isolation from the original perforations and frac locations, but we're going to need CoreLab to come up with a way to perforate through 2 layers of tubulars and 2 layers of cement and give us the access into the reservoir only where we haven't stimulated before. So I think we got a little angular view of this on the next slide where you might be able to appreciate this a little better. So one of the tricks in doing this is you needed an energetic that had sufficient force to get through and cut through 2 layers of tubular and 2 layers of cement, but also, very importantly, develop consistent hole size. Because if you'll notice, that horizontal gun is sitting on the floor of that horizontal well. If the perforation design was similar all the way around the gun, you would end up with a small hole at the top and a big hole at the bottom. Then when you went to pump your frac fluid, you would have big holes that would attract the perforating fluid or the frac fluid, and you would, by virtue of the fluid dynamics, you would understimulate those parts of the reservoir that were only accessed through the small holes. So our ballistics experts were able to come up with a way of collimating or turning that perforating energetic plume from a cone into a column, so that we end up with the same size holes all the way around. Now, when that perforating gun system is retracted and the frac fluid is injected, it uniformly goes through all the holes and can maximize the amount of stimulated rock volume around the entire wellbore. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it's sometimes a challenging task for an operator who's 4 miles away from the location on the surface from actually completing the well. And one of the ways that we help people figure out if they've done that right is through the introduction of our completion diagnostics, or what you might consider as tracers that we introduce into each stage of the completion. So that we show colors here, but we're actually talking about chemical tracers of various types. Those get inserted in with each stage, and then when they flow back to the surface, our clients, with our help, are able to determine if all of the stages are actually contributing to the well. One of the things that comes out of that is where they have closely spaced multi-well pads, if we start seeing, in the case of this example, if we start seeing that light blue tracer showing up in the third well from the right, where it was not introduced, that means that they've bashed the wells, that they've created inter-well communication. There's either natural fractures between those two boreholes, or they have overstimulated the reservoir with their frac job, and they've bashed the wells, which is not a good thing. You can think of 1 + 1 not equaling 2. They've wasted horsepower and proppant. They're not going to get a double stimulation effect there. So we use this to help our client determine optimum well spacing. A huge issue, and one of the key things to remember here is there's never one answer. All of the reservoirs are different. Eagle Ford's different from the Permian, is different from the Bakken, is different from the Marcellus, is different from the Haynesville. The other thing is, even within an individual geologic formation, the natural fracture system can affect the well spacing that's required. The pressures in the reservoir, the lithologic or the geologic attributes of the reservoir can all affect optimum well spacing. So unless you test with these type of diagnostics, you're not going to get an answer as to whether you've got the wells in communication until you look at that production profile over time and realize you're not getting the production that you anticipated out of these adjacent wells. So just toward the end of our thoughts here, what we want to convey, CoreLab's had 3 consistent growth strategies that have been with us for decades and will continue to lean on as we move forward. One is new technology development. And the refrac example I talked about is a great one, where in working in concert with our clients, we come up with technological solutions to help address their problems. The next is, as we develop new technologies, like our CT deliverables, our dual energy CT deliverables for rock analysis. We started out with 1 CAT scanner in Houston 5-6 years ago, and today we've got more than a dozen scattered around the planet. As clients saw the deliverables and said, I want this so that I can run my rocks through it. So as we develop new technologies, we then leverage those through our international network. And lastly, where it makes sense, we'll acquire complementary technologies. We're not a very acquisitive company, but last two acquisitions we made were very much in our wheelhouse. One was some laboratory equipment for doing PVT testing in 2015, and the other was in 2018 to develop a switch that we use as part of our pre-assembled gun system. We acquired a company that made that switch and gave us the last piece that we needed to deliver that pre-assembled gun kit. I think we're about ready for questions at this point.
Tyler, I'll turn it back over to you.
Guys, thank you very much again for that presentation. It's very obvious you guys are old hands at this. Great presentation as always. We really appreciate it. Just to kick off the Q&A, can you discuss the cost reductions and other actions that have been taken as a result of the current industry downturn?
Yeah, Tyler, I guess, I'm heading into 36 years in the industry, and I've got calluses on top of my scars from the previous downturns. As have a lot of our Core Labs has a lot of long-term employees made their careers here. And one of the lessons that we all learned over the previous downturns was in a situation like this, you need to act a day early, not a day late. And you can't sit around and wait for what you think might be a quick snapback. And so Core Lab very aggressively, a lot of credit to the business unit teams, got together and rationalized what we thought the market was going to look like, and started an aggressive plan to get our cost structure aligned with our client activity. That's really the driver for us. What do we see as client activity? Let's get the business right sized to match with that. And so we talked about two phases that we've done of cost cuts. The first we announced at the end of Q1, that was $46 million worth of structural cost cuts. Now, these are not variable costs. These are structural or fixed costs that we took out of the system. Then move forward a little bit, and we get to near the end of Q2, we announced an additional $15 million worth of cuts. So $61 million on an annualized basis that we've got in place, or I'd say that we've instituted. The first $46 million of cuts were all in place at the end of Q2, by the end of Q2. So from the time we announced them toward the end of Q1 till the end of Q2, that $46 million was completed. The additional $15 million of cuts, we will have those all in place by the end of Q3. So on an annualized basis, $61 million of cuts. A lot of thought, a lot of pain, painful decisions had to be addressed, but needed to be done to make sure that we were right sized for the marketplace.
Excellent. Thank you very much. You guys always have a great international perspective. What are your expectations for the international market during the second half of this year?
Yeah, I think so. Just to get folks frame of reference here, we do operate in more than 50 countries, so we do have a very broad international exposure. And I think it's a good question here. What's the short-term outlook there, but also what's the long-term outlook there? I think there's two knobs that are in play here. One is sort of COVID-19 related delays and disruptions that have impacted us pretty much throughout Q2 and are ongoing into Q3. And we've got some nice green shoots that things could be starting to get back to normal business. And then the other part is longer term. If you listen to some of the large IOCs and NOCs that have big development projects, say offshore South America, they've made very conspicuous commitments that they're going forward with those, and that they're not turning back their investments in those large lucrative projects. So I think for the short term, there's going to be some disruptions related to travel restrictions and things like that. And those are really what make it hard for us to give guidance at the moment. It's just too hard to predict. We've had this standby go process with a bunch of our clients. We've got people that have to sit in quarantine at times. But then longer term, I think what we're likely to see is what I would largely regard as an underinvested international conventional reservoir portfolio around the planet is going to start attracting more investment as that becomes a bigger part of replacing the decline that's happening in reservoirs all over the planet. One other point here that I think is worth making, and that is for the near term, reservoir description in particular is a business that tends to lag. So it held up pretty nicely in Q2, but during Q2, new project work was a bit delayed coming in, and so that's going to carry into Q3. We're starting to see a little bit of uptick in that. It takes a little bit of time for that to spool back up before we get new samples in the lab and pick up from there. So the near-term impact of COVID-19 is still with us, and hopefully we see that winding down over the next quarter or two.
Thank you very much. What are your views on U.S. completion activity for the remainder of this year?
Yeah, I think maybe hand it over to Gwen there. I think a little perspective here. So we think that the bottom occurred in probably May in terms of U.S. completions. And so it's come up a bit since then. So Gwen, maybe you fill in some more color on that.
Absolutely. So we monitor both, completion projections as well as frac spreads that are out there, and we also saw the frac spreads bottom around, let's say, 45 last quarter, and I think we've come back up to about 70. So that's pretty good increase, and we see completions improving slightly. That's more likely from a drawdown in the drilled but uncompleted wells that are out there. That's a more, let's say, cost-conscious approach to completions in this particular environment. And so if we can get a little contribution from the completion activity, that will certainly help our production enhancement segment for Q3's performance.
And one thing I'd add to that is our production enhancement products is not just a U.S. onshore business. A good part of that business, I mentioned earlier, about nearly half of that business now is from outside the U.S. As the U.S. has come down, we've always had a good footprint of servicing the international completions, plug and abandonment projects where we sell our energetics into. And so those will offer a little bit of balance for our business as the U.S. rationalizes the right completion rate.
Well, guys, thank you so much again. We always enjoy having CoreLab join us for the Oil and Gas Conference, and we look forward to you joining us more in the future.
Thank you, Tyler.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tyler.